The piercing ring of the telephone sliced through the profound quiet of the early morning, a sharp, unwelcome intrusion that pulled Michael Jordan from the depths of a dreamless sleep. It was precisely 5:03 a.m. when Michael, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to such pre-dawn awakenings, reached for the device on his nightstand. His eyes, clear and focused even moments after waking, registered the name flashing on the screen, Stephen Curry. For a brief second, he paused. A call at this hour was unusual, to say the least. But a deep-seated instinct, honed over decades of high-stakes decisions, compelled him to answer. "Steph," Michael said, his voice a low rumble, steady and alert. On the other end of the line, a silence stretched, thick with an emotion Michael couldn't immediately place, before a voice he knew well, yet had never heard so utterly broken, finally emerged. "Mike, it's me, Steph. Can you perceive that there are moments in life, inflection points, where the entire legacy of a person we think we know is redefined by the raw, unfiltered sound of their pain?" Michael sat bolt upright in bed, a cold wave of concern washing over him, displacing the warmth of sleep. The voice was unmistakably Stephen Curry's, but it was stripped of its usual light and joy. It was heavy, fragile, and saturated with a vulnerability Michael had never associated with the famously cheerful, three-point shattering champion. "Steph, what's wrong? Are you okay?" Michael asked, his own heart beginning to beat a more urgent rhythm. He could hear it clearly now. Steph wasn't just emotional. He was weeping, deep, shuddering sobs that spoke of a soul in turmoil. I had to talk to someone," Steph whispered, his voice cracking in a way that made Michael feel as if he were trespassing on sacred private ground. "And you're the only one I thought might understand." To fully comprehend what drove Stephen Curry, the smiling assassin, the man who revolutionized basketball with a joyous flair, to make this desperate, world-shaking call in the dead of night, we must rewind the clock 6 months. We must go back to a moment that would fundamentally alter his perception of his life, his legacy, and the very definition of what it means to win. It was a brilliant afternoon in the Bay Area, the California sun casting long shadows across the Golden State Warriors' state-of-the-art practice facility. Stephen Curry, at 36 years old, was at the zenith of his powers, an icon whose influence stretched far beyond the hardwood. His brand was a global phenomenon, his family life the picture of idyllic happiness, and his name was etched in the record books as the greatest shooter to have ever played the game. By every conceivable metric, he was the embodiment of modern athletic success, a champion who had achieved greatness not with intimidating force, but with a smile and a seemingly endless reservoir of joy. But behind the effervescent public persona, Steph carried a weight that few could fathom. The burden of being the paragon of a new kind of greatness, the pressure to be perpetually joyful, perpetually accessible, perpetually perfect. What is most impressive is how a reputation for happiness can become its own form of prison, where the expectation of light can make any encroaching darkness feel like a catastrophic failure. On this particular afternoon, Steph was in the film room, ostensibly breaking down defensive schemes for an upcoming road trip, but his mind wasn't on pick and rolls or defensive rotations. He was watching old clips of Michael Jordan, not the high-flying dunks or the championship-winning shots, but interviews. Post-game press conferences from the 90s, snippets from The Last Dance, moments where Jordan, even in victory, exuded an intensity so fierce it was almost terrifying. There was something in the way Jordan carried himself, in the unapologetic fire in his eyes, in the sheer, unadulterated will to dominate, that resonated with a part of Steph he had long kept hidden, even from himself. "He never had to apologize for wanting to win," Steph murmured, pausing the video on a close-up of Jordan's face, his eyes burning with a competitive fury that seemed to transcend the screen. It was a look of pure, unvarnished ambition, a stark contrast to the joyful, almost casual demeanor the world expected from Steph Curry. His wife, Ayesha, had noticed a shift in him lately, a new level of introspection that sometimes bordered on melancholy. "You seem to be thinking a lot about your legacy these days," she had remarked a few nights prior, over a quiet dinner at home. Steph had taken a long moment to answer, swirling the wine in his glass, wrestling with thoughts he found difficult to articulate. "I just wonder if I've been enough," he finally said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I mean, I know I've won, but did I dominate? Did I instill that fear the way he did? How is it possible for a man who has changed the very fabric of his sport to feel that his accomplishments are somehow incomplete?" The comparison wasn't about rings or trophies. It was about impact, about the psychological weight a player carries. For years, Steph had been celebrated as the anti-Jordan, the hero who was relatable, human, and joyful. He had built his empire on approachability. But now, as he entered the twilight of his career, he began to question that narrative. He remembered the battles, the grit, the relentless work it took to reach the top. But he also remembered the constant, subtle pressure to temper his own competitive fire, to package it in a more palatable, family-friendly form. He remembered the sting of losses, the quiet moments of rage and frustration that he felt he could never truly show the world, lest he shatter the illusion of the happy-go-lucky champion. His reflections were interrupted by a call from his agent, Jeff Austin. "Steph, just got off the phone with the network," Jeff said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want to do a legacy documentary. The whole 9 yards. Think The Last Dance, but for your era. The dynasty, the revolution you started." Steph felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The project should have been a triumphant capstone to his career, a celebration of everything he had achieved. But instead, it felt like a trap, a final cementing of a public persona that he was beginning to feel was suffocatingly incomplete. "I'll think about it," Steph said, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be a museum piece just yet. Can you perceive that sometimes the moments that are meant to be our greatest validation can trigger our deepest insecurities, forcing us to confront the gap between who the world thinks we are and who we know ourselves to be?" That evening, Steph found himself in his home gym, not shooting threes, but on the treadmill, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. He was chasing something, a feeling of raw effort and pain that felt more real than the adulation of millions. He thought about Jordan again, about the stories of his punishing workouts, his legendary refusal to lose at anything, from a playoff game to a game of cards. Jordan had embraced the darkness of his own ambition, weaponized it. Steph, on the other hand, felt like he had been running from his own for his entire career. As he ran, a sharp, unfamiliar pain shot through his left knee, the same knee that had been surgically repaired years ago. It wasn't the dull ache of overuse. It was a piercing, insistent signal that something was wrong. He stumbled off the treadmill, his breath catching in his throat. It was the first time in a long time that his body, the finely tuned instrument of his craft, had sent him a message of such undeniable alarm. He sat on the floor of the gym, the sterile silence amplifying the frantic beating of his heart. For the first time in his career, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. Not the fear of missing a shot or losing a game, but the existential fear of his own physical limits, of the inevitable end that comes for every athlete. It was in that moment, alone and in pain, that Steph began to question everything. If his body failed him, what would be left? A legacy of joyful shots? Or would it all just fade away, a pleasant but ultimately lightweight chapter in the grand, violent history of the sport? Naturally, this leads us to the moment when a hero begins to confront not just his physical mortality, but the mortality of his own narrative. Realizing that he had built a legacy of joy, but questioning whether he had built a legacy of unyielding, undeniable, timeless greatness. True greatness is not just about winning. It's about the story you leave behind. And for the first time in his life, Stephen Curry was about to discover what it truly meant to write his own ending, even if it meant tearing down the very myth he had helped create. The coming weeks would test not only his physical health, but his courage to explore the darker, more complex parts of his own ambition, the parts of himself he had been taught to hide, but which Michael Jordan had worn as a crown. The MRI results, lay on the polished surface of the coffee table like a formal indictment. The crisp white envelope from Dr. Richard Ferkel's office seemed to mock the sunny, cheerful decor of the Curry household. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on the treadmill. 2 weeks of doctor's appointments, scans, and a gnawing anxiety that Steph had tried to conceal behind his trademark smile. He had faced down 7-foot defenders and the crushing pressure of the NBA Finals. But this was a different kind of opponent. This was an enemy within, one he couldn't outshoot or outsmart. His hands, usually so steady as they released a basketball, trembled almost imperceptibly as he slid the films out of the envelope. Aisha sat beside him on the sofa, her presence a silent, supportive anchor in the swirling sea of his thoughts. The familiar scent of her perfume, usually a comfort, now seemed to mingle with the sterile, antiseptic smell of the medical report, creating a disorienting cocktail of intimacy and fear. Can you perceive that the moments that truly test us often arrive not on a public stage, but in the quiet intimacy of our own homes, where the masks we wear for the world are laid bare? The report itself was a cascade of medical jargon, chondral damage, degenerative changes, significant articular cartilage wear. But the summary at the bottom, written in plain English, was a gut punch. Progressive arthritic condition exacerbated by chronic athletic stress. Continued high-impact activity carries a significant risk of permanent, debilitating injury. A managed reduction in workload and intensity is strongly advised. Steph let the report fall from his grasp. He leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling, as if the answers were written there. The words echoed in his mind. Managed reduction. Debilitating injury. It wasn't a career-ending diagnosis, not yet. But it was a death sentence for the way he played, for the relentless, all-out effort he was just beginning to realize he craved. His body, the source of his magic, the vessel for his unprecedented skill, was betraying him. What is most impressive is how the quiet language of a medical document can shout louder than the roar of 100,000 fans, instantly changing the trajectory of a life. That afternoon, instead of heading to the practice facility, Steph found himself in his home theater, doing the one thing that felt both like a comfort and a form of self-torture: watching Michael Jordan. He wasn't watching for tactical analysis anymore. He was watching as a man confronting his own limitations, desperately searching for a roadmap. On the screen, Jordan was in the midst of his flu game, a performance of such legendary grit that it had become a cornerstone of his myth. Doubled over, exhausted, visibly ill, yet still dominating, still bending the game to his indomitable will. There was no managed reduction in Jordan's eyes. There was only the raw, terrifying force of a man who refused to be broken by illness, by opponents, by his own physical frailty. Steph felt a surge of something he could only identify as a profound, soul-deep envy. It wasn't for the rings or the accolades. It was for the freedom. The freedom to be ferocious, to be angry, to suffer openly and be celebrated for it. Jordan's pain was proof of his greatness. Steph's pain, he feared, would be seen as a sign of weakness, the inevitable dimming of a light that was always meant to burn bright, never to flicker. "When I watch him," Steph said to Asha later that evening, his voice quiet and heavy, "I see a man who was allowed to be a warrior. The world celebrated his killer instinct. They called me a baby-faced assassin, like my killer instinct had to be cute, had to be qualified." He walked over to the trophy case in his study, a gleaming monument to a revolutionary career. 4 NBA championship trophies, 2 MVP awards, a finals MVP trophy. It was a testament to a dynasty. But as he stared at the golden figures, he didn't feel the warm glow of accomplishment. He felt a chilling emptiness, as if they were symbols of a story he hadn't been allowed to fully write. Aisha came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. She could feel the tension in his body, a coiled spring of frustration and fear. "Steph, you changed the game forever. You made it beautiful. You don't have to be him." "But what if I wanted to be?" He shot back, the words sharper than he intended. What if the joy and the beauty were just the only things they would accept from me? What if, deep down, I wanted to burn it all down just to win, just like he did? What does that make me? It's impossible not to feel your own heart ache when you witness a person questioning the very foundation of their identity, realizing that the role they've played to perfection may have been a role, not a reality. The question hung in the air, a confession of a long-suppressed truth. He had become so adept at being the joyful, humble, accessible Steph Curry that he had lost touch with the part of himself that was just a stone-cold killer, a competitor who hated losing more than he loved winning. In the weeks that followed, Steph's obsession with Jordan's career intensified. He wasn't just watching games. He was reading biographies, listening to old podcast interviews with Jordan's teammates and rivals. He was studying the anatomy of a legend, trying to understand the source of that unquenchable fire. He came across an old article by a veteran sports writer, Marcus Thompson II, who had covered both men. Michael Jordan commanded respect through fear. Thompson had written, Stephen Curry commands it through love. Both are paths to greatness, but they forge entirely different kinds of legacies. The word fear resonated with Steph. He had never sought to be feared, but now, facing the potential erosion of his physical gifts, he wondered if love was enough. Love was fickle. Fear was eternal. One evening, scrolling through social media, he saw a clip from a fan event. A young boy asked him, Steph, how do you always stay so happy, even when you lose? Steph had given his standard, polished answer about perspective and gratitude, but watching it now, he cringed. He remembered the feeling after that particular loss, of bitter, acidic rage that he had swallowed down and converted into a placid smile for the cameras. He had not been happy. He had been furious. True greatness is not about the absence of negative emotions, he thought, staring at his own smiling face on the screen. It's about having the permission to feel them. He began to understand that his entire public identity had been built on a form of emotional suppression. He was the hero who made you feel good. But what if he didn't feel good? What if he was angry, or scared, or broken? Where did those feelings go? How is it possible that it can take an entire career to realize that the strength the world admires in you is also the cage that confines you? It was during one of these long, soul-searching nights, about 5 months after the MRI that had started it all, that Steph hit a breaking point. Ayesha and the kids were out of town visiting family. The house was cavernously silent, the quiet amplifying the storm in his mind. He had spent a lifetime being the anchor for his team, his family, his fans. He was the source of light, the man who brought the joy. But that night, alone with his fears about his knee, his legacy, and the dawning realization that he might not truly know himself, Stephen Curry, the icon of happiness, finally succumbed to the darkness he had held at bay for so long. Naturally, this leads to the moment when the brightest of lights begins to flicker, when the need for an authentic human connection outweighs the lifelong duty to be an inspiration. It was 1 a.m. when Steph, his hands shaking not from a physical ailment but from a profound, terrifying vulnerability, picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, past agents, teammates, and family, until he found the one name that felt like both a terrifying leap and the only possible lifeline: Michael Jordan. True greatness is not never falling. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching. And sometimes, the most courageous act is admitting that you don't know how to get up, especially when the whole world believes you never fall. The pre-dawn stillness of the Bay Area was absolute, a heavy blanket of silence that did nothing to quiet the tempest in Stephen Curry's mind. He sat in his home theater, the giant screen dark, his phone clutched in his hand like a talisman. It was 4:58 a.m. on a moonless night in August, and Steph had been awake for hours, wrestling with a panic attack that had ambushed him in his sleep. It began as a tightness in his chest and had metastasized into a full-blown crisis of self, an overwhelming feeling that the person the world knew as Steph Curry was a fragile construct about to shatter into a million pieces. The house, usually filled with the vibrant chaos of family life, was eerily quiet. Asha and the kids were still on the East Coast, leaving Steph in a solitary confinement with thoughts he could no longer outrun. For years, he had perfected the art of emotional alchemy, transforming his private anxieties into public displays of grace and joy. But on this night, after months of a slow-burning identity crisis, his defenses had crumbled. Can you perceive that there are moments when the silence of an empty house becomes a deafening roar, amplifying the fears we've successfully ignored in the noise of our daily lives? The panic had been triggered by a nightmare. In it, he was on the court at the Chase Center, but his legs were made of sand. He tried to run, to shoot, but he was stuck, sinking, while the crowd watched in silent, disappointed judgment. He woke up gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom feeling of powerlessness clinging to him like a shroud. He had tried everything that usually worked: deep breathing, a walk through the silent house, even putting up a few shots in his gym. But the feeling of impending doom wouldn't recede. The fear that his body was failing, that his legacy was a hollow facade, that he was a fraud, was all-consuming. It was then, in a moment of sheer, unadulterated desperation, that he thought of Michael Jordan. Not as a rival or a historical benchmark, but as perhaps the only other human on the planet who could possibly fathom the crushing weight of being a global icon, of having your very identity fused with your athletic performance. What is most impressive is how, in our moments of deepest crisis, our instincts guide us not to those who will comfort us, but to those who we believe can truly understand the unique architecture of our pain. Steph had Jordan's number from a corporate event years ago, a contact saved but never used, filed under MJ. Now, staring at those two letters on his screen, he felt a tremor of fear. "He's going to think I'm weak," Steph whispered into the darkness. The happy-go-lucky shooter, calling him at 5 a.m. crying. The thought was mortifying. But the alternative, to sit alone and let this wave of panic and despair drown him, was infinitely worse. For the first time in his celebrated career, Stephen Curry was facing an opponent he couldn't beat with a smile and a perfect jump shot. He was facing the raw, terrifying truth of his own humanity. And he was losing. At exactly 5:03 a.m., with a trembling finger, he pressed the call button. The phone rang, each tone echoing the frantic beat of his own heart. He half hoped Jordan wouldn't answer, that he could retreat back into his silent suffering. But a deeper part of him, the part that was suffocating, prayed for a voice on the other end of the line, any voice, to pull him back from the edge. "Steph." Jordan's voice was immediate, clear, and utterly present. It was a voice accustomed to command, yet it held a note of simple, human recognition that, for the first time in hours, made Steph feel real. How is it possible that a single word, spoken by a voice of authority, can act as a lifeline, pulling us from the depths of our own internal chaos? "Mike." Steph tried to speak, but the name came out as a choked sob. The dam of composure he had maintained for his entire adult life finally broke. The tears he had swallowed for years began to flow, hot and unstoppable, a torrent of suppressed fear, frustration, and a loneliness so profound it had become invisible to everyone, including himself. "It's me, Steph." On the other end of the line, in his home in Florida, Michael Jordan was instantly, completely alert. He heard something in that shattered whisper that transcended the early hour, a sound of genuine breakage that triggered an instinctual, protective response. "Steph, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "It's 5 in the morning. I can't." Steph struggled to form a sentence, the words lost in the wreckage of his weeping. "I had to talk to someone, and you're the only one I thought might understand." Jordan was out of bed now, pacing, the full weight of the moment settling upon him. He was hearing the confession of a king in exile, the private pain of a public figure he had watched and, in his own way, admired from afar. "Understand what, Steph? Talk to me. Where are you?" "I'm at home. I'm alone," Steph managed to say, the words punctuated by ragged breaths. "And I can't do it anymore, Mike. I can't be him anymore. I can't be the happy guy all the time. It's impossible not to feel your own world tilt on its axis, When you hear a man famous for his joy confess that his happiness is a prison. Be who? What are you talking about? Jordan pressed, his voice firm but gentle, a coach trying to guide a player through a moment of crisis. And then, it all came pouring out. Not the polished, media-trained Stephen Curry, but the raw, terrified, and profoundly angry man who had been living underneath. "I'm a fraud, Mike," he began, the confession tearing from his throat. "My whole career, my whole identity, it's a fraud. I'm not the joyful warrior. I'm just angry. I'm angry that I've had to smile through the losses. Angry that my body is breaking down. Angry that my legacy feels soft." The word soft, coming from the man who had redefined toughness in the modern era, hung in the air with devastating weight. Jordan was silent for a moment, processing the sheer, shocking honesty of the confession. Soft? Steph, you're a 4-time champion. You changed the way the game is played forever. That's what they say. Steph's voice rose, cracking with a frustration that sounded decades old. But you were a killer. You were feared. I'm beloved. Do you know what that feels like? To be beloved, but not feared? It feels like being a pet, not a predator. I have spent my entire life being the good guy, the role model, the one who makes everyone comfortable. And I hate it. Can you perceive that sometimes the greatest compliments the world pays us can feel like the most damning insults, defining us in ways that deny our own complex truth? Jordan sat down on the edge of his bed, completely captivated by the most unexpected and vulnerable conversation he had ever had with a fellow athlete. "Steph, you can't possibly—" "Don't you get it?" Steph interrupted, his voice now a low, intense whisper. "I've watched you my whole life. You never apologized for your fire. You never made it smaller for anyone. Your rage was part of your greatness. My rage, I have to hide it. If I get angry, I'm petulant. If you got angry, you were a competitor. I see you with your rings, and I know you'd trade them all for one more win. Me? People think I'd trade a win for a good photo op with my family. How is it possible for a pre-dawn phone call to become the confessional for the soul of a generation's greatest champion?" "And now," Steph whispered, his voice finally breaking completely, "now, my body is giving out. This thing that made me special is failing. And I look at my legacy and I realize I built a kingdom of sand, a beautiful, sparkling kingdom that everyone loves, but a sandcastle that will wash away. You built yours out of rock, out of fear and will and rage. It will stand forever." The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, Jordan was no longer the mythical GOAT. He was just a man listening to the profound pain of another man who had walked a similar, yet starkly different path. He heard the exhaustion, the loneliness, and the courage it took to make this call. "Steph," Jordan finally said, his own voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. "You think I don't understand? You think it was easy being me?" The question caught Steph completely off guard. "What?" "You see the rings, the fear, the killer instinct," Jordan continued, his voice low and resonant with memory. "You don't see the cost, the friendships I destroyed, the family moments I missed, the loneliness at the top of a mountain you built by yourself. You talk about my kingdom of rock. It's a damn lonely kingdom, Steph. I look at you, at the joy you have, the connections you've built with your teammates, your family, the fans, and you want to know the truth? I've envied you." Naturally, this leads to the moment of stunning revelation, when two titans of the sport, two opposing definitions of greatness, find that they have been staring across a chasm at the one thing the other possesses and desperately craves. "You envied me?" Steph asked, his tears momentarily stopping. "I taught the world how to win," Jordan said, his voice filled with a wisdom forged in fire. "But you, Steph, you taught them how to win and still be human. You think that's soft? That's the hardest damn thing in the world. I was too much of a coward to even try." It was the most shocking confession of all, that Stephen Curry, in his perceived weakness, had achieved a form of greatness that Michael Jordan himself had found unattainable. Can you perceive that sometimes the very things we see as our greatest failures are, in fact, our most profound triumphs in the eyes of others? You think this call is weakness? Jordan's voice grew stronger, more forceful. This is the strongest thing you've ever done. You're not building a kingdom of sand, Steph. You're building it out of light. And light is a hell of a lot stronger than rock. The conversation that began in the depths of despair at 5:03 a.m. stretched on as the first hints of dawn began to paint the California sky. By the time Jordan and Steph finally hung up the phone at 7:21 a.m., the world outside was waking up to a new day, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in the souls of two of its greatest icons. It was more than a phone call. It had been a soul-bearing exchange, a moment of such profound and unexpected connection that it had irrevocably altered the landscape of both their lives. Steph remained in his theater, the phone still warm in his hand, feeling like a man who had been pulled from a wreckage. The panic had subsided, replaced by a quiet, fragile sense of peace. He didn't have answers, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel utterly alone in his questions. Someone had seen him, not the smiling icon, but the struggling Menand had not turned away. In fact, he had been told that this struggling man was the strongest version of himself. Can you perceive that the most profound healing comes not from being fixed, but from being seen? Across the country, Michael Jordan stood on his balcony, watching the Florida sun climb into the sky, reflecting on a conversation that had shaken his own long-settled understanding of his life's work. For 3 hours, he had listened as Steph had unpacked years of suppressed frustration, and in doing so, Michael had been forced to look at his own reflection in Steph's pain. He had offered wisdom, but he had also received an unexpected gift, a new perspective on the cost of his own greatness. What is most impressive is how offering guidance to another can often illuminate the dark corners of our own lives, revealing truths we were not ready to face alone. I taught them how to win, but you taught them how to be human. He had said the words to comfort Steph, but as he replayed them in his mind, he realized how deeply he meant them. In the weeks that followed that transformative call, a quiet but fundamental shift began in Stephen Curry. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic overhaul, but those closest to him noticed. Aisha saw it first when she returned home. There was a new stillness in him, a willingness to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately plastering over them with a smile. "You seem more here," she said one evening, noticing how he listened, truly listened, without the subtle distraction that had been his constant companion for months. "I had a talk," Steph replied, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "A talk that reminded me that it's okay not to be okay. How is it possible that a single conversation can grant us the permission we've been waiting a lifetime to give ourselves?" Steph started making changes. In a team meeting, after a particularly frustrating practice, he didn't retreat into stoic silence as he usually would. He spoke up, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm pissed off, guys," he said, stunning the room into silence. "I'm pissed that we're not playing up to our standard, and I'm done pretending it doesn't bother me." It wasn't an attack. It was a raw, honest admission, and it had a galvanizing effect. His teammates, used to his unflappable positivity, saw a new depth of leadership, a fire they had only glimpsed before. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan was also changing. The conversation had awakened something in him, a sense of responsibility and perhaps regret for the generation of athletes who had tried to emulate his fire without understanding its human cost. He started reaching out to younger players, not just to talk business or brand building, but to check in, to listen. He called Ja Morant. He texted Luka Doncic. He was becoming the mentor he never had, the one who understood that the pressures of the game were nothing compared to the pressures of the myth. 2 months after the call, Steph and Michael met in person at a league event. As they saw each other across the crowded room, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of a 5 a.m. confession. Their handshake was more than a greeting. It was the meeting of two worlds, two legacies, that had once seemed diametrically opposed, but were now deeply intertwined. "How's the kingdom?" Michael asked, his eyes twinkling with a knowing warmth. Still under construction, Steph replied, his smile easy and unforced. But the foundation feels a lot more solid. Can you perceive that the strongest bridges are often built not between 2 points of strength, but across a shared chasm of vulnerability? The sports world began to notice the change in Steph. Journalists wrote articles about a new, more intense Curry, a player who seemed to have shed a layer of his affable persona to reveal a core of pure, unadulterated competitive steel. Some critics called him arrogant, a departure from the humble hero they loved. But his true fans and his teammates saw it as an evolution, a man finally integrating all the parts of himself. 6 months after the call, Steph sat down for a long-form interview with a respected journalist. He didn't reveal the details of his conversation with Michael that was sacred, but he spoke with a startling new honesty about his struggles with the pressure to be a joyful icon. I think for a long time, I felt like my only acceptable emotion was happiness, he said, his words resonating across the sports landscape. And I've learned that true strength isn't about hiding your anger or your fear. It's about owning all of it. Greatness isn't one-dimensional. The interview exploded. It was a revelation. The world, so accustomed to Steph Curry as a symbol of uncomplicated joy, was stunned by his complexity, his pain, his anger. Millions of people, just athletes, saw their own struggles reflected in his words. The pressure to perform, to maintain a facade of happiness at work, in families, in life. Steph's confession gave them permission to be whole. Michael watched the interview from his home, a rare, proud smile on his face. He saw the courage of the man who had called him in the dead of night, now using his platform to liberate others. Naturally, this leads us to the moment we understand that a private act of courage can become a public act of revolution, changing not just 2 lives, but the entire conversation. A year after that fateful call, the Curry-Jordan Foundation for Authentic Leadership was launched. Its mission was simple: to support athletes and leaders in navigating the pressures of public life, and to promote a new, more holistic understanding of mental health and strength. That call didn't just save me from a bad night, Steph said at the launch event, Michael standing by his side. It taught me that my humanity isn't a liability to my greatness. It's the source of it. It's impossible not to feel a surge of hope when we realize that our deepest moments of crisis can become the catalyst for our most important work. The story of the 5 a.m. call became a quiet legend, its details never fully known, but its impact felt everywhere. It was a story about 2 icons who discovered that the space between fear and love, between rock and light, was where true greatness resided. True greatness is not never falling. It's having the courage to get up when no one is watching, to own every part of your story, to be vulnerable enough to ask for help, and to realize that the person you think is your opposite may, in fact, be your salvation. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to pick up the phone in the dark and admit that even with all the trophies in the world, you are, in the end, simply and gloriously human.